Chapter 10. Toffees, Tennis Balls and the Buddhas of Swat. First the Taliban took our music, then our Buddhas, then our history. One of our favorite things was going on school trips. We were lucky to live in a paradise like Swat with so many beautiful places to visit: waterfalls, lakes, the ski resort, the Wali's palace, the Buddha statues, the tomb of a Kind of Swat. All these places told our special story. We would talk about the trips for weeks beforehand, then, when the day finally came, we dressed up in our best clothes and piled into buses along with pots of chicken and rice for a picnic. Some of us had cameras and took photographs. At the end of the day my father would make us all take turns standing on a rock and tell stories about what we had seen. When Fazlullah came there were no more school trips. Girls were not supposed to be seen outside. The Taliban destroyed the Buddha statues and stupas where we played, which had been there for thousands of years and were a part of our history from the time of the Kushan kings. They believed any statue or painting was haram, sinful and therefore prohibited. One black day they even dynamited the face of the Jahanabad Buddha, which was carved into a hillside just half an hour's drive from Mingora and towered 23 feet into the sky. Archaeologists say it was almost as important as the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which the Afghan Taliban blew up. It took them 2 goes to destroy it. The first time they drilled holes in the rock and filled them with dynamite, but that didn't work. A few weeks later, on October 8, 2007, they tried again. This time they obliterated the Buddha's face, which had watched over the valley since the 7th century. The Taliban became the enemy of fine arts, culture and our history. The Swat Museum moved its collection away for safekeeping. They destroyed everything old and brought nothing new. The Taliban took over the Emerald Mountain with its mine and began selling the beautiful stones to buy their ugly weapons. They took money from the people who chopped down our precious trees for timber and then demanded more money to let their trucks pass. Their radio coverage spread across the valley and neighboring districts. Though we still had our television, they had switched off the cable channels. My Niba and I could no longer watch our favorite Bollywood shows like Shararat or Making Mischief. It seemed like the Taliban didn't want us to do anything. They even banned one of our favorite board games called Carom, in which we flick counters across a wooden board. We heard stories that the Taliban would hear children laughing and burst into the room and smash the boards. We felt like the Taliban saw us as little dolls to control, telling us what to do and how to dress. I thought if God wanted us to be like that He wouldn't have made us all different. One day we found our teacher Miss Hamida in floods of tears. Her husband was a policeman in the small town of Mada, and Fazlullah's men had stormed in and some police officers had been killed, including her husband. It was the first Taliban attack on the police in our valley. Soon they had taken over many villages. The black and white flags of Fazlullah's TNSM started appearing on police stations. The militants would enter villages with megaphones and the police would flee. In a short time they had taken over 59 villages and set up their own parallel administrations. Policemen were so scared of being killed that they took out adverts in the newspapers to announce they had left the force. All this happened and nobody did a thing. It was as though everyone was in a trance. My father said people had been seduced by Fazlullah. Some joined his men, thinking they would have better lives. My father tried to counter their propaganda but it was hard. I have no militants and no FM radio, he joked. He even dared to enter the radio mullah's own village one day to speak at a school. He crossed the river in one of the metal boxes suspended from a pulley that we use as makeshift bridges. On the way he saw smoke so high it touched the clouds, the blackest smoke he'd ever seen. At first, he thought it might be a brick factory, but as he approached he saw bearded figures in turbans burning TVs and computers. In the school my father told the people, "I saw your villagers burning these things. Don't you realize the only ones who will profit are the companies in Japan, who will just make more?" Someone came up to him and whispered, "Don't speak anymore in this way, it's risky." Meanwhile, the authorities, like most people, did nothing. It felt as though the whole country was going mad. The rest of Pakistan was preoccupied with something else. The Taliban had moved right into the heart of our nation's capital, Islamabad. We saw pictures on the news of what people were calling the Burqa Brigade, young women and girls like us in burqas with sticks, attacking CD and DVD shops in bazaars in the center of Islamabad. The women were from Jamia Hafsa, the biggest female madrasa in our country and part of Lal Masjid, the Red Mosque in Islamabad. It was built in 1965 and got its name from its red walls. It's just a few blocks from Parliament and the headquarters of IC, and many government officials and military used to pray there. The mosque has two madrasas, one for girls and one for boys, which had been used for years to recruit and train volunteers to fight in Afghanistan and Kashmir. It was run by two brothers, Abdul Aziz and Abdul Rashid, and had become a center for spreading propaganda about bin Laden, whom Abdul Rashid had met in Kandahar when visiting Mullah Omar. The brothers were famed for their fiery sermons and attracted thousands of worshippers, particularly after 9/11. When President Musharraf agreed to help America in the war on terror, the mosque broke off its long links with the military and became a center of protest against the government. Abdul Rashid was even accused of being part of a plot to blow up Musharraf's convoy in Rawalpindi in December 2003. Investigators said the explosives used had been stored in Lal Masjid. But a few months later he was cleared. When Musharraf sent troops into the Fatah, starting with Waziristan in 2004, the brothers led a campaign declaring the military action un-Islamic. They had their own website and pirate FM station on which they broadcast, just like Fazlullah. Around the same time as our Taliban were emerging in Swat, the girls of the Red Mosque Madrasa began terrorizing the streets of Islamabad. They raided houses they claimed were being used as massage centers, they kidnapped women they said were prostitutes and closed down DVD shops, again making bonfires of CDs and DVDs. When it suits the Taliban, women can be vocal and visible. The head of the madrasa was Umma Hassan, the wife of the elder brother, Abdul Aziz, and she even boasted that she had trained many of her girls to become suicide bombers. The mosque also set up its own courts to dispense Islamic justice, saying the state had failed. Their militants kidnapped policemen and ransacked government buildings. The Musharraf government didn't seem to know what to do. This was perhaps because the military had been so attached to the mosque. But by the middle of 2007 the situation was so bad that people began to worry the militants could take over the capital. It was almost unbelievable. Islamabad is usually a quiet, orderly place, very different to the rest of our country. Finally, on the evening of 3rd of July, commandos with tanks and armored personnel carriers surrounded the mosque. They cut off the electricity in the area, and as dusk fell there was a sudden burst of gunfire and explosions. The troops blasted holes in the wall surrounding the mosque and fired mortars at the compound as helicopter gunships hovered overhead. Over loudspeakers they called for the girls to surrender. Many of the militants in the mosque had fought in Afghanistan or Kashmir. They barricaded themselves and the madrasa students inside concrete bunkers with sandbags. Worried parents gathered outside, calling their daughters on mobile phones, begging them to come out. Some of the girls refused, saying their teachers had taught them that to become a martyr is a glorious thing. The next evening a small group of girls emerged. Hidden among them was Abdul Aziz, disguised in a burqa, along with his daughter, but his wife and younger brother stayed inside, along with many students, and there were daily exchanges of gunfire between the militants and the troops outside. The militants had RPGs and petrol bombs made from Sprite bottles. The siege went on until late on 9th of July, when the commander of the special forces outside was killed by a sniper in one of the minarets. The military finally lost patience and stormed the compound. They called it Operation Silence, although it was very loud. Never had there been such a battle in the heart of our capital. Commandos fought from room to room for hours until they finally tracked Abdul Rashid and his followers to a basement where they killed him. By nightfall on 10th of July, when the siege was finally over, around 100 people had been killed, including several soldiers and a number of children. The news showed shocking pictures of the wreckage, everywhere blood and broken glass, and dead bodies. We all watched in horror. Some of the students at the two madrasas were from Swat. How could something like that happen in our capital city and in a mosque? A mosque is a sacred place for us. It was after the Red Mosque siege that the Swat Taliban changed. On 12 July, which I remember because it was my birthday, Fazlullah gave a radio address that was quite different to his previous ones. He raged against the Lal Masjid attack and vowed to avenge the death of Abdul Rashid. Then he declared war on the Pakistani government. This was the start of real trouble. Fazlullah could now carry out his threats and mobilize support for his Taliban in the name of Lal Masjid. A few days later they attacked an army convoy traveling in the direction of Swat and killed 13 soldiers. The backlash wasn't just in Swat. There was an enormous protest by tribesmen in Bajaur and a wave of suicide bombings across the country. There was one ray of hope: Benazir Bhutto was returning. The Americans were worried that their ally General Musharraf was too unpopular in Pakistan to be effective against the Taliban, so they had helped broker an unlikely power-sharing deal. The plan was that Musharraf would finally take off his uniform and be a civilian president, supported by Benazir's party. In return he would drop corruption charges against her and her husband and agree to hold elections, which everyone assumed would result in Benazir becoming prime minister. No Pakistani, including my father, thought this deal would work, as Musharraf and Benazir hated each other. Benazir had been in exile since I was 2 years old, but I had heard so much about her from my father and was very excited that she would return, and we might have a woman leader once more. It was because of Benazir that girls like me could think of speaking out and becoming politicians. She was our role model. She symbolized the end of dictatorship and the beginning of democracy, as well as sending a message of hope and strength to the rest of the world. She was also our only political leader to speak out against the militants and even offered to help American troops hunt for bin Laden inside Pakistani borders. Some people obviously did not like that. On October 18, 2007, we were all glued to the TV as she walked down the steps of the plane in Karachi and wept as she stepped onto Pakistani soil after almost 9 years in exile. When she paraded on an open-top bus through the streets, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to see her. They had traveled from all over the country and many of them were carrying small children. Some released white doves, one of which flew to perch on Benazir's shoulder. The crowds were so large that the bus moved at a walking pace. We stopped watching after a while as it was clearly going to take hours. I had gone to bed when just before midnight the militants struck. Benazir's bus was blown up in a wave of orange flame. My father told me the news when I woke up the next morning. He and his friends were in such a state of shock that they had not gone to bed. Luckily, Benazir survived because she had gone downstairs to an armored compartment to rest her feet just before the explosions, but 150 people had been killed. It was the biggest bomb ever to have gone off in our country. Many of the dead were students who had made a human chain around the bus. They called themselves martyrs for Benazir. At school that day everyone was subdued, even those who had opposed Benazir. We were devastated but also thankful that she had survived. About a week later the army came to Swat, making lots of noise with their jeeps and helicopters. We were at school when the helicopters first arrived and were very excited. We ran outside and they threw toffees and tennis balls down to us, which we rushed to catch. Helicopters were a rare sight in Swat, but since our house was close to the local army headquarters they sometimes flew right over us. We used to hold competitions for who would collect the most toffees. One day a man from along the street came and told us that it had been announced in the mosque that there would be a curfew the next day. We didn't know what a curfew was and were anxious. There was a hole in the wall to our neighbor's house, Safina's family, through which we used to communicate with them, and we knocked on the wall, so they would come to the hole. "What does it mean, this curfew?" we asked. When they explained, we didn't even come out of our rooms because we thought something bad might happen. Later the curfew took over our lives. We heard on the news that Musharraf had sent 3,000 troops into our valley to confront the Taliban. They occupied all government and private buildings which they thought were of strategic importance. Until then, it had seemed as if the rest of Pakistan was ignoring what was happening in Swat. The following day a suicide bomber attacked another army truck in Swat, killing 17 soldiers and 13 civilians. Then all that night we heard dar dar dar, the boom of cannons and machine guns from the hills. It was hard to sleep. On the TV the next day we heard that fighting had erupted in the hills to the north. School was closed, and we stayed at home, trying to understand what was going on. The fighting was taking place outside Mingora, though we could still hear gunfire. The military said it had killed more than 100 militants, but then on the first day of November around 700 Taliban overran an army position at Kwazakila. Some 50 men deserted from the Frontier Corps and another 48 were captured and then paraded around. Fazlullah's men humiliated them by taking their uniforms and guns and giving them each 500 rupees to make their way back. The Taliban then took 2 police stations in Kwazakila and moved on to Madian, where more police officers gave up their weapons. Very quickly the Taliban controlled most of Swat outside Mingora. On 12th of November Musharraf ordered 10,000 more troops into our valley with additional helicopter gunships. The army was everywhere. They even camped on the golf course, their big guns trained on the hillsides. They then launched an operation against Fazlullah, which later became known as the First Battle of Swat. It was the first time the army had launched an operation against its own people outside the Fatah. Police once tried to capture Fazlullah when he was speaking at a gathering, but a giant sandstorm blew up, and he managed to escape. This added to his mystery and spiritual reputation. The militants did not give up easily. Instead, they advanced to the east and on 16th of November captured Alpuri, the main town of Shangla. Again local police fled without a fight. People there said Chechens and Uzbeks were among the fighters. We worried about our family in Shangla, though my father said the village was too remote for the Taliban to bother with and local people had made it clear they would keep them out. The Pakistan army had far more men and heavy weapons, so they quickly managed to recapture the valley. They took Imam Dari, the headquarters of Fazlullah. The militants fled to the forests and by early December the army said they had cleared most areas. Fazlullah retreated into the mountains. But they did not drive the Taliban away. This will not last, my father predicted. Fazlullah's group was not the only one causing havoc. All across northwestern Pakistan different militant groups had emerged led by people from various tribal groups. About a week after the Battle of Swat, 40 Taliban leaders from across our province met in South Waziristan to declare war on Pakistan. They agreed to form a united front under the banner of Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, or the Pakistan Taliban, and claimed to have 40,000 fighters between them. They chose as their leader a man in his late 30s called Baitullah Masood, who had fought in Afghanistan. Fazlullah was made chief of the Swat sector. When the army arrived we thought that the fighting would soon stop, but we were wrong. There was much more to come. The Taliban targeted not only politicians, MPs and the police, but also people who were not observing purdah, wearing the wrong length of beard or the wrong kind of shawl or kameez. On 27th of December Benazir Bhutto addressed an election rally in Liaquat Bagh, the park in Rawalpindi where our first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali, was assassinated. We will defeat the forces of extremism and militancy with the power of the people, she declared to loud cheers. She was in a special bulletproof Toyota Land Cruiser, and as it left the park she stood up on the seat and popped her head through the sunroof to wave to supporters. Suddenly there was the crack of gunfire and an explosion as a suicide bomber blew himself up by the side of her vehicle. Benazir slid back down. The Musharraf government later said she hit her head on the roof handle, other people said she had been shot. We were watching the TV when the news came through. My grandmother said, Benazir will become Shaheed, meaning she would die an honorable death. We all started crying and praying for her. When we learned she was dead, my heart said to me, why don't you go there and fight for women's rights? We were looking forward to democracy and now people asked, if Benazir can die, nobody is safe. It felt as if my country was running out of hope. Musharraf blamed Benazir's death on Baitullah Masood, the TTP leader, and released a transcript of an intercepted phone call that was supposed to be between him and a fellow militant discussing the attack. Baitullah denied responsibility, which was unusual for the Taliban. We used to have Islamic studies teachers, Qari Sahib, who came to our home to teach the Quran to me and other local children. By the time the Taliban came I had finished my recitation of the complete Quran, what we call Khatam al-Quran, much to the delight of Baba, my grandfather the cleric. We recite in Arabic, and most people don't actually know what the verses mean, but I had also started learning them in translation. To my horror, one Qari Sahib tried to justify Benazir's assassination. "It was a very good job she was killed," he said. "When she was alive she was useless. She was not following Islam properly. If she had lived there would have been anarchy." I was shocked and told my father, "We don't have any option. We are dependent on these mullahs to learn the Quran," he said. "But you just use him to learn the literal meaning of the words, don't follow his explanations and interpretation. Only learn what God says. His words are divine messages, which you are free and independent to interpret."